They didn't come for you with knives. That would have been too honest. Instead, they came dressed in approval. Soft nods, polite claps, smiles stretched just wide enough to hide the teeth underneath. You remember how it felt, the way their eyes didn't light up when you spoke, the way their laughter always stopped 1 second too soon when it was your turn to speak. It wasn't obvious, not at first. It was a war fought in glances, in omissions, in the way your name was never quite included when it mattered. And you told yourself it was nothing, just timing, just bad luck. You hadn't yet learned that some people don't hate your flaws, they hate your potential. You walked into rooms with sincerity, open, eager, naive enough to think effort was its own shield, but your silence didn't make you invisible. It made you a threat. You thought they'd lift you as you rose. Instead, they tightened the noose each time you climbed. They smiled while rearranging the room so you'd always face the wrong direction. Their compliments came like traps, heavy with condescension and hidden instructions. Be smaller, be quieter, be grateful, but never be more. And when you began to outgrow the cage, they didn't fix the bars. They painted them gold and called it your place. The scar didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with the slow erosion of certainty, a gut feeling you couldn't name, an instinct sharpened over months of psychological frostbite. You began second-guessing your intuition, questioning your perception. You wondered if you were being paranoid, too sensitive, too hungry. But deep down, in the marrow of your instincts, you knew this wasn't just indifference. It was designed. The way they dimmed your presence, diluted your voice, diluted you. It wasn't random. It was choreography. You were being managed. And then came the shift, the quiet flicker of rebellion beneath your ribs. You stopped smiling when it wasn't earned. You stopped lowering your voice so theirs could echo louder. The moment you pulled back, not with rage but with cold awareness, you felt the tremor in their masks. They had mistaken your kindness for blindness, mistaken your patience for permission. And when they could no longer predict you, they panicked. They tried to smother that flicker before it became a fire, but it was too late. They wanted to humble you, but not in the way that means teach you. No, they wanted to reduce you, compact you into a version that wouldn't make them uncomfortable, because people like them don't fear evil. They fear excellence, quiet excellence, the kind that doesn't perform, the kind that exists without asking. They couldn't control your talent, so they tried to control your image. And when that failed, they resorted to their last weapon: erasure. Not destruction, just removal, uninvited, overlooked, muted. But they didn't understand what they were building. Every silence became your scripture. Every slight became your study. They weren't breaking you. They were writing your origin story, one scar at a time. At first it was subtle, a missed word here, a delayed response there. You'd speak, and they'd nod without listening, as if your presence required acknowledgement, but not respect. They didn't strike you direct. They eroded you slowly, like a silent river wearing down stone. They disguised their contempt in carefully measured doses of politeness, always just enough to deny you the right to call it cruelty. You weren't being attacked, you were being rewritten. You began to notice the pattern, compliments with barbed wire laced beneath them, jokes that didn't land yet always landed on you. They built an architecture of smiles and silence, where every glance carried two meanings and every room whispered with conspiracies you couldn't quite name. You wondered if you were imagining it, until you weren't, until the timing of their praise always aligned with your restraint, until your efforts were always almost, until they began to celebrate your failures more loudly than your wins. This was not clumsiness. This was design. They were teaching you your place without ever using the word less. You were not being punished. You were being reshaped, slowly, psychologically. They were planting seeds of hesitation in your mind, hoping doubt would grow faster than your confidence. Your intelligence made them uncomfortable. Your presence disrupted their hierarchy. So they did what the ancient predators always did when confronted with something they could not control. They broke your reflection before you could see yourself clearly. They didn't need to touch you to harm you. They just had to tilt your world until your own shadow betrayed you. A misplaced meeting, a private conversation that wasn't meant to be heard, a change in tone when you walked into the room. All pieces of a quiet war. You were not facing soldiers. You were facing architects, masters of omission, artists of psychological decay, people who understood that real control doesn't scream, it whispers. And it whispers until you start to speak its words as if they were your own. You stopped raising your hand. You stopped finishing your sentences. You started asking for things you used to claim. You internalized the humiliation, carried it like a ghost in your chest, unsure where the wound had come from, but certain it was yours to bear. That was the point, not to break your back, but to convince you to kneel on your own. But then something ancient stirred inside you, a flicker of clarity behind the fog. You began to see the game for what it was. Not a failure on your part, but a strategy on theirs. And with that awareness came silence. Not the silence of defeat, but calculation. You stopped explaining yourself. You started watching. You listened to the way they spoke to others when they thought you weren't listening. You saw the blueprint, the pattern, the weakness disguised as dominance. And that's when they started to fear you, not because you fought back, but because you stopped reacting altogether. Because the silence that once signaled your doubt now echoed with something far more dangerous: understanding. They thought silence meant surrender, but yours was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of sharpening. While they laughed in rooms that smelled of hollow victories, you were somewhere darker, a colder, a space so still it terrified even your own reflection. You did not cry there. You recalibrated. Every betrayal replayed like a coded transmission. Every lie dissected like a weapon blueprint. You no longer asked why. You began asking how. They believed they had buried you beneath their mockery, but they didn't realize seeds are always buried before they rise. They mistook your withdrawal for collapse, not realizing they had only trimmed the surface. Beneath, your roots spread like shadow vein, in secret, in silent, in sacred calculation. And that silence became your crucible. You learned the art of absence, how to be gone without being forgotten, how to fade just long enough for your name to ferment into mystery. The old version of you, the one that sought validation, that explained itself, that tried to be digestible, was dismantled piece by piece. You didn't mourn its passing. You performed the autopsy yourself. You found the weakness. You traced its origin to the need for acceptance. And then you cut it out like a tumor, not in anger, in precision, surgical, final. The world kept spinning, unaware that something ancient had awakened inside you, a part of yourself long dormant, buried under years of conditioning and compromise. You began to feel it in quiet moments, that internal shift, the cold burn of new resolve. Your mind, once fragmented by doubt, reassembled itself into something crystalline, reflective, indestructible. You became your own oracle, your own weapon, your own witness. They thought you were healing. You weren't. Healing implies a return to what was. You were becoming something entirely new, less human, more elemental, the kind of force they only understand when it's too late. You didn't chase closure. Closure is for the innocent. You studied patterns. You watched how they moved when they thought you weren't watching. You tracked their language, the rhythm of their manipulation, the tells in their facade. You became fluent in their deception until you could predict their moves before they even thought them. They talked, you listened, they performed, you recorded, and in the vault of your mind, a strategy was forming, not out of vengeance, but inevitability. You weren't planning revenge, You were crafting inevitability, a quiet return so undeniable. They'd choke on the silence before your name even left their lips. You didn't need an audience. You needed distance. You didn't need recognition. You needed restraint. They were still playing checkers on a collapsing board. You had moved to a higher game, one with no spectators, one where time, patience, and obscurity were your most loyal soldiers. Let them laugh. Let them underestimate. Let them believe the silence meant peace, because somewhere in the places they'll never look, you were building an empire of one. You returned, but not as the version they remember, the one they tried to break, the one they mistook for soft because you didn't claw back when they clawed at you. That version died quietly, without funeral or witness, buried beneath months of silence and calculated stillness. What rises in its place does not beg for recognition. It watches. It waits. It moves with the gravity of something ancient, something forgotten but never defeated. You walk into rooms and the temperature shifts. They can't name it, but they feel it. A presence sharpened by betrayal, tempered by exile. Your words are fewer now, chosen like blades, each syllable a cut, each pause a silence they can't defend against. Their smiles tighten, their laughter falters. They look at you and see a shadow of what you were. And they're right, because shadows survive the fire. You learned that truth in the quiet, in the cold, when their absence wrapped around you like a cloak and made you invisible. And from that invisibility you built something they will never comprehend. A mind no longer moved by approval, a heart that no longer bleeds for the undeserving. You learned the sacred art of withholding, the discipline of not reacting, of letting them speak while you listen to what their masks betray. Their power relied on your need to be seen. Now you need nothing from them, and in that detachment you become dangerous, not loud, not reckless, but inevitable, like a tide too large to hold back, like nightfall arriving whether they want it or not. Your presence doesn't demand attention, it steals it, quietly, completely. They try to provoke the old you, the eager one, the one that smiled too easily, trusted too fast. But you're no longer in the business of being understood. You're not returning to explain. You're returning to witness their unraveling, not by your hands, but by the weight of their own illusions. They underestimated the cost of your silence, thought your absence meant surrender. But some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. Some arrive dressed in calm and leave nothing standing. Now every interaction is an echo, a ghost of who you were walking alongside, who you've become. They feel the duality, but can't name it. You've become something mythic, not in their words, but in their discomfort. They look at you and see everything they couldn't kill. They remember the campaign to humble you, and now they avoid your gaze because it forces them to remember that they failed. You don't gloat. That would imply you care, and nothing terrifies them more than your indifference. They wanted to make you small, manageable, but all they did was teach you how to disappear and rebuild. And now that you're back, silent, sovereign, and self-contained, they understand too late that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't need to be in it. You became the thing they tried to erase, a presence too large to ignore and too quiet to predict. They thought you disappeared, faded, broken. In truth, you were calibrating. While their laughter echoed through hollow rooms, you were making silent pacts with the darker parts of yourself, the parts that no longer begged to be understood. They mistook your absence for retreat, unaware that you were weaving something beneath their feet. Not revenge, not noise, precision. You stopped trying to be seen and started moving like myth. You stopped explaining and started building. Every insult became a data point, every betrayal a breadcrumb. You no longer reacted to their moves. You studied them like ancient diagrams. Where they played games, you built systems. Where they performed power, you embodied it. And in rooms where your name was erased, your impact began to whisper through walls like smoke no hand could grasp. They didn't see the shift, not at first. You spoke less, but your silence gained weight. Your presence, once overlooked, began to warp the air. People who once laughed now lingered too long when you passed. You said nothing, yet they heard the echo of something coming, something old, something unnameable. You began aligning with forces they can't pronounce. Not luck, not fate, but the timeless current that rewards those who endure long enough to stop needing validation. You took the long road, the slow, brutal path where your tears had no audience and your genius had no applause. But it sharpened you. They thought they buried you in silence. They didn't know silence was your element. You didn't just rise, you infiltrated, quietly, surging. While they sought followers, you built leverage. While they faked alliances, you nurtured patience like a hidden weapon. Now the ground is shifting. You enter the same rooms they once guarded, and the air doesn't ask permission. You sit where you were once excluded, and the table feels altered. They glance uncertain, smile too wide, laugh too loudly. They remember how they tried to humble you. They remember what they said. And now each success you breathe is a mirror held to their faces. Not loud, not cruel, just undeniable. But this isn't vengeance, it's orchestration. You no longer care to humiliate them because your existence does it better than you ever could. Every word you speak now is weighed. Every move you make, dissected. You're not chasing attention, you're shifting architecture. And they feel it. They feel that you know, that you always knew. You're not angry anymore. You're focused. You're no longer the apprentice begging for access. You're the architect they never saw coming. And you don't speak of what they did, not because you've forgiven it, but because it no longer defines the terrain you walk. You're building something bigger, something none of them can touch. Something shaped from silence, betrayal, and cold strategic fire. And still they watch, powerless to stop it, powerless to understand it. They wanted to humble you, but in doing so they carved the shape of their own irrelevance. They didn't expect the reckoning to arrive in silence. No lightning, no grand monologue, just a moment, precise, inevitable, where the room turned cold without warning. You entered without announcement, yet every eye snapped to you as if a storm had slipped in wearing your skin. Their faces twitched, their posture shifted. The ones who once laughed loudest now whispered behind dry mouths, uncertain whether to greet you or prepare for exile. You didn't plan this stage. It unfolded like prophecy, a meeting, a decision, a reveal, and somehow every thread they spun around your downfall began unraveling right there, in their own hands. A name they twisted, a document they buried, a lie they dressed as truth. It all surfaced not by your accusation, but by time's quiet justice. Someone spoke, not you, a bystander, then another. Eyes shifted, tension tightened, like wolves sensing the alpha they'd mocked had returned with sharper fangs. And still you said nothing. Your silence weighed more than any outburst ever could. You didn't need to expose them. They did that with every frantic word, every broken sentence, every desperate attempt to rewrite history in front of witnesses who had already stopped believing. Their confidence cracked first, then their voice, then their hierarchy. The room they once ruled became a cave, and your mere presence bent the bars inward. You watched them collapse under the weight of their own theater, one mask at a time falling to the floor like ash. The irony, they had once taught you the art of humiliation, slowly, strategic, with smiles and false praise and well-timed erasure. They trained you in the language of subtle destruction, and now they were choking on their own dialect. You weren't angry, you weren't vengeful, you were something far more dangerous. You were composed, unbothered, inevitable. You realized then that power isn't volume, it's voltage, and your silence surged through the room like an ancient current. They couldn't comprehend, couldn't contain. Every time they looked at you, they remembered the version of you they tried to break, and every time you didn't react, It reminded them of the power they gave away. In underestimating, they tried to explain, to pivot, to pretend it was all misunderstood. But the damage was already carved into their image, burned into the memory of everyone who watched their empire collapse, not from attack, but from exposure. You turned, not out of arrogance but purpose. Your back to their chaos wasn't dismissal, it was prophecy. They were never your enemy, merely your lesson, a necessary scar in the story of your ascent. And as your footsteps echoed behind you, their legacy shattered not from what you did, but from who you had become. Their humiliation wasn't your revenge, it was their reflection. And for the first time they were forced to look. They don't speak your name the way they used to. It used to be a whisper behind closed doors, a smirk masked as a compliment, a dismissal laced with envy. Back then you were framed as a lesson, not of power but of arrogance. Watch them fall, they said, too fast, too proud. But now, they hesitate, not because they've changed, but because you did. Because every word they once weaponized now boomer back with violent irony. Because in the end they didn't bury you, they unearthed. You don't haunt them with noise, you haunt them with the vacuum you left behind. The space you occupied now echoes, not with your voice, but with the realization of what they tried to silence. They feel it when decisions stall, when rooms feel colder, when plans lack precision. You were never just part of the system, you were the axis, and they only understood it when it stopped spinning. There's no apology, of course, no confessions, only rewrite, subtle distortions of memory, where they were always the victors, always the mentors, always the misunderstood. But the myth they've tried to sculpt without you crumbles. Because no matter how they frame it, the timeline doesn't lie. Your growth was exponential, your absence terminal, your rise undeniable, and every attempt to eclipse you only further sharpened your silhouette. You are spoken of now in tones reserved for things half human, half legend, not revered exactly. Respected? Maybe. Feared? Certainly. The ones who once sat at your table now study your methods like scripture. The same steps they ridiculed, they replicate. The same boundaries they crossed, they now enforce in their own lives. Your past choices became their survival tactic, but they'll never admit it out loud. They'll just imitate, poorly, in the hope no one sees the blueprint. And you don't retaliate. You don't respond. You operate above the noise. Because the myth you've become is louder than any rebuttal. You don't crave their downfall. You are their reckoning, not through violence but through permanence. They were momentary. You became structural. Their stories fade under the weight of your silence, and their laughter decays into nervous memory. You became what they feared, not the rebel, not the outcast, but the record. The scar etched into the timeline, proving what happens when someone survives the crucible and comes back forged, not fractured. You carry no banners, you build no statues, yet still your presence lingers, in glances exchanged, in plans revised, in rules rewritten too late. They wanted to humble you, but humility was never the lesson. The lesson was this: when you try to shame someone who has already survived their own darkness, you only shine a spotlight on your own weakness, and in that light, they saw themselves clearly for the first time. Now they walk quieter, speak slower, not out of wisdom, but out of memory, because somewhere beneath all the denial, they remember what you were, and more terrifying, they remember what you became. They still speak your name, but never directly, as if saying it aloud might summon you from the walls. You became a ghost, not one that haunts halls but minds, the kind they try to forget, but always remember in the quiet between distraction. You never returned to argue, never corrected their retellings. You let them sculpt the myth, knowing silence always makes the story louder. They don't know where you are, what you're building, or how close you truly stand. That terrifies them more than anything you ever said. There was a time they celebrated your absence. Now they fear your stillness, because in your silence you became untouchable. You removed yourself from their theater, dismantled their stage with your absence, and while they orbit conflict like moths circling old flame, you moved in shadow, not to hide, but to study. You traded reaction for strategy, emotion for execution, and when you finally moved, the world didn't clap. It paused, because your motion was not noise, it was gravity. You never needed revenge. It became the evidence. Every breath you take now is a contradiction to the story they wrote about you. Every achievement a mirror they can't look into without wincing. You outgrew the narrative they buried you in. Their greatest insult is now their deepest embarrassment. They tried to humble you, but you became their humiliation, not through vengeance, but by living so far beyond their imagination, they can't even copy you correctly. Now you speak only when necessary, and when you do, it's not conversation, it's scripture, measured, rare, final. You are not louder, you are heavier. The ground shifts when you enter a room. People lean forward, not because you're dramatic, but because what you say is surgical. They wait for your silence to end, and when it doesn't, they fill the gap with speculation. Your absence is louder than their performance ever was. You move like an omen. Not for them, they're already lost, but for those who walk the same edge you once did. The overlooked, the underestimated, the ones forced into stillness by betrayal. They see you and know it's possible. Not easy, not instant, but inevitable. You became what they tried to prevent. You became the version of yourself that had no need for applause, only precision. You built an empire that has no walls, no throne, just vision. Quiet, relentless vision. And they became statues in the museum of your memory. Dusty reminders of a time when you still needed permission to be powerful. You don't walk past them with anger. You don't even look. Power doesn't return to prove itself. It builds cathedrals in places no one thought to dig. No one sees the full shape of what you are now. That's the point. You are not a storm. You are the pressure before it. You are not the fire. You are the silence before the spark. You learned that the ones who speak too much reveal their coordinates. You have no coordinates. You have no ceiling. You became the story they cannot retell without trembling, and the silence you carry now is a crown they will never be able to steal.